On August 18, 1920, Harry Byrne, the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, broke the deadlock between the pro and anti-suffrage forces by casting his vote in favor of ratification of the 19th Amendment. It was an historic moment. Harry's vote carried the amendment over the finish line, making Tennessee the 36th and last state required to ratify. 8 days later, women's suffrage became the law of the land. Overnight, the US Constitution guaranteed 27 million American women the right to vote. It was the biggest expansion of democracy in our history. It was the culmination of a fight that took more than 70 years to win, one that became the model for nonviolent protests that set the stage for the civil rights movement decades later. It is fitting to our program today that the most dramatic moment in the fight for suffrage took place in Tennessee, a southern state, the last one to join the Confederacy. The southern state that supplied more soldiers to the Union Army than all other Confederate states combined. Tennessee was divided by questions of race in the 19th century, and those questions were on hand 60 years later in its debate over suffrage. When Harry Byrne cast his decisive vote, he defied those in the Tennessee legislature who feared that enfranchising African American women would shift the balance of power in the South. Over the next hour, we're going to hear the voices of 6 historic figures whose experiences reflect the legacy of slavery and race as it played out in the fight for women's suffrage and beyond. Our first voices are those of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, now both in their 70s. It's February 1895, and they meet before a women's convention at which Douglass is to speak. They are seeing each other for the first time after some absence, and they reflect on their decades-long friendship and the events that strained that friendship to near breaking. Let me set the stage. At the time of our convention, Douglass and Anthony are international celebrities. They had met when both were fighting to end slavery. Over time, Anthony's attention was drawn increasingly to women's rights, a cause that was also dear to Douglass, who considered himself a women's rights man. In the 1880s, women's rights didn't add up to much. Most doors to education were closed to women. Professional careers were out of the question. When they married, women gave up their legal status. Their wealth went to their husbands. And not only couldn't they vote, women married or not, by custom, were not even allowed to speak in public if men were present. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the fierce suffragist who became Anthony's loyal friend, organized the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention to protest these conditions. It marked the start of the organized suffrage movement. Frederick Douglass was among the 300 men and women who attended. Anthony, Stanton, and Douglass were friends and allies working tirelessly to end slavery and win the vote. And when the Civil War began, Anthony and Stanton threw their energy into the war effort. They helped win passage of the 13th Amendment ending slavery, and they expected that their effort would be recognized. It wasn't. The 15th Amendment granted former male slaves the vote, but not women. The omission tested the Anthony Douglass friendship and caused a bitter rift in the suffrage movement itself that lasted 21 years. The estrangement between Anthony and Douglass was shorter. 7 years after the breakdown of the relationship, the two were again collaborating. Let's listen in as Douglass and Anthony, together near the end of his life, reflect on this history.
Good morning, Mr. Douglass. Welcome.
And good morning to you, Miss Anthony. Thank you for your invitation to visit a while.
Please have a seat, and we will have tea soon. But first, let me look at you and enjoy the sight of you. It's been a good while since we last talked.
It has indeed. And I want to say how pleased I am that you will be escorting me tonight at the National Councils of Women's meeting. As I contemplate this moment, I have to ask, how is Miss Stanton doing?
She is not so well and doing less traveling, or she would be with us tonight. She sends you greetings. She is my dearest friend, and I miss her. But we still, from time to time, write one more speech together. We've written so many that I've lost track of the number.
I do remember the first time I heard her speak. Seneca Falls in 1848. She astounded the crowd at the first women's rights movement meeting when she proposed a radical addition to several resolutions denouncing the wrongs visited upon women due to a defect of sex. Seeking redress, she proposed this addition: resolved that it is the duty of women of this country to secure for themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. I will never forget Lucretia Mott, who cried out, "Why, Lizzie, thee will make us ridiculous. Thee goes too fast." But it was clear at that moment that moving cautiously was not what Miss Stanton wanted, even though the crowd did not seem with her, and even her husband left the meeting. I know you know this tale, although you were not there, but I like to remember that of the men of that gathering, I was the only one who spoke in favor of the motion, and the only one who voted for it. It passed by a small majority. I know there have been times where you may not believe this, but I feel strongly about suffrage for women. I have done little in this world in which to glory except in this one act, and I certainly glory in that. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. And when I advocated emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question. And I found a little nobility in the act.
I did question where you stood, especially in those years after the war when our Congress proposed a 14th Amendment in which men were mentioned 3 times and women not at all. The 14th and 15th Amendments sorely tried that bond we had formed over the years. Remember, it was a bond built out of countless miles traveled and doors knocked on and local meetings held in support of the abolition of slavery. We even gave up work for suffrage to further the cause of abolition. Then the 14th Amendment conferred citizenship upon the freedmen, but it sounded a warning for us women who generally favored Negro citizenship, but were troubled by the fact that 3 times the 14th Amendment referenced the right to vote of male citizens. Until then, the Constitution had not specifically excluded women from the vote. In fact, nowhere previously had there been any reference to sex in the Constitution. I admit that generally it was assumed that women would not vote, but we saw that the 14th Amendment would codify what had previously been custom alone. Many of us were distressed, even angered by the 14th Amendment. And I still think with good cause. Remember, we stopped working for suffrage so we could work for abolition. Especially in the late 1850s and early 60s, women took part in the war effort. Anna Ella Carroll devised the Tennessee River Strategy, for which General Grant took credit. Doctors Elizabeth Blackwell and Mary Walker and nurses Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton organized efforts to care for wounded soldiers, and they were often there providing the care themselves. Anna Dixon's campaigning was essential to Lincoln's 1864 reelection. And Harriet Tubman. Harriet. Harriet headed the intelligence service of the Union in the South, as well as led troops into battle. It seems to me that should have put an end for all time to the notion that women are inferior, but it did not. and we were left out. We felt betrayed, deserted by our Negro and abolitionist supporters when faced with the upcoming 15th Amendment. Mrs. Stanton and I and others working for women's rights decided that if women were not offered the vote together with Blacks in that amendment, we would prevent its passage. We did not succeed.
Well, here are some things I knew but could not say then. At least I could not say them all. I supported women's suffrage. Nevertheless, I knew that a set of circumstances, the end of a great war, the assassination of President Lincoln, the struggle between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republican Congress, the fact that the Southern states were out of the Union and could be coerced into ratification as the prize of readmission to the Union. All of these created a unique opportunity to enfranchise freedmen. The Northern states were either indifferent, having at too small a Negro population to pose any threat to their power structure, or Republican dominated and scenting the power of 2 million new, almost certain Republican voters. I also saw that the essential Northern states felt strongly about propriety of women's voting. They were not for it. And I felt that the inclusion of women's suffrage would result in a loss of the amendment, denying the right to vote to women and Negro alike. The 15th Amendment was of overriding importance to the very survival of the newly freed slaves. I felt only the ballot could shield them from the wrath of their former masters. Only the ballot could provide access to education. Only the ballot could guard their painful won economic foundations. Only the ballot could provide protection from the terrorist organizations that were springing up throughout the former Confederacy. You may remember the speech I gave in 1869 to the Equal Rights Association. When women, because they are women, are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their houses burned down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot. And a voice shouted out from the back, "Is that not true of Black women?" And I replied, yes, it is true of the Black woman, but not because she's a woman, but because she is Black.
And around this time, I remember a debate that you and I had. Do you? I said, Mr. Douglas talks of the wrongs of the Negro, but with all of the outrages that he today suffers, he would not exchange his sex and take the place of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
And I said, I want to know if granting you the right of suffrage will change the nature of our sexes.
And I responded, it will change the pecuniary position of women. It will place her where she can earn her own bread. She will not then be driven to such employments only as a man chooses for her. As I said those words then, and they still hold true, I remembered an earlier speech for the New York legislature that I helped Mrs. Stanton write. We identified laws that taxed unmarried women's earnings while not giving them the right to representation. We showed how legal servitude made it impossible for a woman to be judged by a jury of her peers in criminal cases. We demonstrated that while married women now had the legal right to property, they could not exercise that right, as the law placed them in the same position as a convicted criminal by denying them the right to contract, buy, sell, or bequeath in their own names. The widow was further disadvantaged, as the law gave the husband the absolute right to will away his property, including any she brought to the marriage. We observed that in the statute books, free men held power over women like feudal barons had held over their vassals. We knew then and today that only suffrage could free us from such servitude. You and I, we have seen injustice and have worked to change it. And still, women are without the vote. And I know that in the South, the Negro has effectively lost the vote and struggles under a heavy yoke. Still, I believe that women will achieve the vote. There are new leaders rising, and a few Western states have enfranchised women. Although I've never thought state by state is the best way to achieve suffrage, I cannot be sorry for any gain we make. As to the South, perhaps women voting will help to tame the worst impulses of men.
The next day, Frederick Douglass was dead of a massive heart attack. Anthony stayed with his widow to help with the funeral arrangements. She delivered the eulogy for her friend at his memorial service. While Anthony and Douglass were discussing the racial divide in the suffrage movement, African American women were living it. The experience of Black women in the fight for the vote has been at best underreported and for the most part ignored. But from the start of the suffrage movement, African American women were there. They too spoke out, organized, and advocated. They were both fighting for the vote and against the racial prejudices of a nation, including those of the white suffrage movement. As African American activist Mary Church Terrell put it, they had the double burden of Blackness and womanhood. The suffragists were about to meet. Ida Wells Barnett, better known as Ida B. Wells, was one of these women. Ida Wells was born in Mississippi in 1862, 6 months before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Her parents died of yellow fever, leaving her at age 16 in charge of her siblings. She worked as a teacher to support them. When her close friends were lynched by a white mob, she published an expose and eventually developed into an internationally known anti-lynching crusader. She became a distinguished journalist and publisher and the high-profile target of racial attacks. Wells married in 1895 and became Ida Wells Barnett. Wells Barnett challenged white suffragists who were ignoring the injustices against Blacks. And despite their disappointing response, she remained a staunch suffragist who organized African American women to fight for the vote and to end the racial injustices that plagued their communities. Women's clubs, sororities, and churches played a critical role in this fight. They were the testing grounds for African American women to develop their leadership and advance their causes, including suffrage. Wells Barnett founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. With white activist Belle Squire, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago, the first African American women's suffrage organization in Illinois. Her work laid the groundwork for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But let's invite Ida Wells Barnett herself to tell her story.
Most of you know my work as a journalist, pursuing the eradication of our national crime, lynching. I have written for many Negro newspapers across the country. Mississippi is where I began my work as a teacher at only 16. After my 2 brothers and 2 sisters and I were orphaned, I learned that I could make a better salary in nearby Memphis, and so we relocated there. Living in Memphis enabled me to take summer college courses to earn my teaching certificate. As I rode to class in the ladies' car one morning, I was confronted by a conductor who told me to move to the colored car. I refused. When I did so, he attempted to physically remove me. When we got to the next stop, he found another conductor and the station manager, and together they successfully dragged me from my seat and threw me into the colored car. I was injured in the fracas. I determined right there to retain a lawyer. And on Christmas Eve, 1884, the circuit court ruled that I was wrongfully ejected from my seat and ordered the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad to pay me $500 in damages. At age 22, I had struck a blow against Tennessee's first Jim Crow law. Of course, that was not the end of the story. The railroad attorneys threatened me and promised they would appeal to the state Supreme Court, which of course they did. The court overturned the verdict, saying I had intended to harass the C&O company and ordered me to pay more than $200 in court costs. I was disappointed because I had hoped great things from my suit, for my people generally. I had firmly believed all along that the law was on our side, and when appealed to it, it would give us justice. Justice, I saw, was not intended to be ours, even when we fought for it. This sparked a rage against injustice that has remained with me. And while the verdict broke my heart, it toughened my spirit. After all was said and done, I pursued my teaching, but I knew I was ready for another career. So, in 1885, when I was invited to write a column for the Memphis Evening Star, I took the opportunity. Then in 1892, I wrote my first story for the Free Speech, a local newspaper, this time covering the murder and lynching of 3 Memphis shopkeepers who were my friends. From there, I began a crusading campaign against lynching, which many white Americans considered appropriate punishment for a Negro who had allegedly committed a crime, great or small. My new career had begun. I was writing newspaper accounts about lynchings, making it clear that the victims were denied the right to a fair and speedy trial, a right to which every citizen is entitled. I wrote columns for papers and had speaking engagements in many states. I also made my first trip abroad, hoping that the British audiences would see that Americans could not see this, the tragic shamefulness of torturing, maiming, and murdering its Negro citizens. Many of you are aware of the burning of my newspaper offices in Memphis and the murder of one of my associates. Since then, I have not returned to the South. I learned that armed vigilantes were awaiting my return in the train station in Memphis. My fellow friend and editor, T. Thomas Fortune, offered me a full-time position at his newspaper, the New York Age. The Age is a paper I had contributed to very frequently. I declined his offer, but I continued my coverage for many papers and my speaking engagements. While I was immersed in the horror of covering lynchings, writing pamphlets, and speaking, I became more and more aware of the significance of voting and electing those who could change Jim Crow laws and speak out against lynching. Only the power of the vote could do that. The 15th Amendment brought the ballot to Negro men, not to any women. Despite the amendment, Negro men face so many obstacles of voting that they might as well not even have the right. So, my work as a suffragist is grounded in the need for the vote to be extended to all men and all women without reservation. Remember, ladies, our cause is the same.
As events continue to unfold, the black and white paths to women's suffrage remain separate. By the turn of the 20th century, the white icons of suffrage were in their 80s and ready to pass the baton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902. Susan B. Anthony in 1906. Aunt Susan, as Anthony became known to the young activist, spent the last years of her life grooming the next generation of white suffragists. Among that next generation was New Jersey's own Alice Paul, born in 1885 in Mount Laurel. Paul, like Susan B. Anthony, was a Quaker, a group that has nearly always come down on the right side of history, including their opposition to slavery and their progressive attitudes toward women. Paul's family was well educated, and she continued in the family tradition. She studied in England after graduating from Swarthmore, and later earned doctoral and law degrees. While studying in England, Alice Paul joined the militant British suffrage movement. She organized, marched, and was arrested multiple times. In prison, she joined the hunger strikes of her fellow suffragettes, as they were called in England, and endured the tortures of force feeding. Paul returned to the US in 1910, ready to take up the suffrage cause here with the same passion and activism she'd learned from her British mentors. But what she found was a national suffrage movement that had lost its momentum. Its tactics were conservative, its enthusiasm was waning. It was focused on waging state-level campaigns to win suffrage, and it hadn't won a state in years. Paul had no patience for this. She joined the National Suffrage Organization and immediately began arguing for a shift in strategy. She wanted to focus on a federal amendment and adopt radical headline-grabbing tactics. In time, she broke with the traditional organization and formed the National Woman's Party, dedicated to the passage of a federal amendment and notorious for its militancy. Her first big splash was the 1913 Women's Suffrage Procession, a high-profile, nationally covered 5,000 plus women's parade in Washington, D.C. on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration. The march was a big deal. Women traveled to the Capitol from around the country. They produced elaborate floats and enacted classical tableaus. Washington police failed to provide the requested protection, and hecklers in the crowd harassed and injured marchers. Pictures of the assaults and the pageantry made papers across the nation. It was just the buzz and the shot in the arm Paul intended. But behind the scenes, there was a complication Paul did not intend. In the lead up to the march, political realities were vying with moral principles in the complex question of race was once again on the table. Alice Paul, a Quaker and a social justice crusader, was confronted with a moral decision that, as it turns out, will bring Ida Wells Barnett back on our stage. Let's imagine Alice Paul as she struggles with the race question in an imagined letter to her sister. It's 1913, days before the grand suffrage procession.
Oh, dear sister, please hear me out. I am in such a quandary. A decision is being forced upon us regarding our march. And in making it, I must find a balance between our Quaker heritage and the realities of today. The matter about whether colored women are welcome in our procession has come up again, and right on the eve of the march. In early January, when someone first inquired about this, we thought that not many Negro women would want to participate, so we said yes. A few might be tucked among friendly women from the North, and they would not be very noticeable. And so we said, then just as planning was getting underway, a woman wrote to our journal asking whether Negro women could march. Then I began to worry that the question might be publicized. What if a majority of white marchers were to say that they refused to participate if Negroes in any number formed a part of the parade? But as a Quaker, I am predisposed to side with and not against the Negro in any question of racial difference. But racist feelings in Washington have been very bitter this winter. I am worried that we must have a white procession or a Negro procession or no procession at all. I thought it would be best to say nothing whatever about the question because we wanted to keep it out of the newspapers. At first, the editor agreed. Then one of the national officers heard about this and she was very upset. She wrote that we could not even think of turning down an application from colored women. The suffrage movement had to stand for enfranchising every single woman in the country, both black and white. But still I worried, especially when we received a stream of inquiries. Just 2 weeks ago, I heard from a group of young women at a colored sorority here. They wanted to march and wondered what section they would be in. I delayed answering until I asked a group of men, members of our Quaker faith. They said that the college women would be welcome to march with them. There are only a dozen or so. Perhaps they will not be noticed. Other groups of Negro women will be at the end of the procession. But then today, I learned that there is a colored woman in Chicago who wants to march with the Illinois delegation. It is probably that Mrs. Barnett, who has fought so fiercely against lynching. Oh, what should we say? Mrs. Barnett will not march at the end of the procession. Does she not know how much her insistence can damage all that we are working for? So many women from all over the country have worked so very hard to make this grand procession a success. The floats, the music, the banners, even our disputes, we have managed to keep them from becoming public. But can that continue? This woman from Chicago, she is a journalist. If she objects to marching at the end of the procession, she will probably talk to the newspapers. And oh, we do not want that. But dear sister, in saying this, am I being unfaithful to our heritage? Are my efforts in accord with our beliefs? As Quakers, we have long struggled for the equality of all. For a century, we fought to free our colored brethren from the evil oppression of slavery. Was that not enough? Now, our black brothers can vote along with our white brothers. And when our campaign for women's suffrage is finally successful, our black sisters will be able to vote along with the rest of us. Can that Chicago woman not understand this? Would she doom our campaign? Perhaps my best response would be to say nothing. But is this an honorable way? For now, I do not want to be confrontational. I want to find a middle way through the conflict. The colored women have their rights, and our family has helped to fight for them. But what of the other women, those who do not agree with those rights? Must I not support them as well? And will any of us, Mrs. Barnett herself, or our sisters in the South, both the colored women and the rest, benefit by endangering the success of our cause? Oh, what should I do?
Alice Paul made her decision. The women's suffrage procession was held March 3rd, 1913, and her instructions were that the African American suffragists should march at the end of the parade. But that's not the end of the story. Let's listen to Ida Wells Barnett, that Chicago woman, tell us how she responded to Alice Paul's instructions.
The end? The end, you say? Behind the white women, the Negro women would march alone. At the end of the parade, that is your thinking, your solution? that we should be pushed back, hidden, an afterthought? What even make you think that would be acceptable to us? Yes, it would make it seem like we are not part of you or part of this effort. Oh, is that it? You think we hurt your cause? Foolish. Is it not the same cause, the same goal? No matter what color, men have refused to let us have the right to vote. We're all women. When the 15th Amendment passed, it was as lost to us as it was to you. And you think it important to secure your suffrage before ours? We reject that. Yes, all men have the right to vote, but in the case of Negro men, not the means. Oh yes, I know. Some of you agree that we are all sisters in the struggle, but not all of your ranks agree. The majority of your Southern members wish to have nothing to do with us. Our presence in this fight and this parade will ruin white women's chances to win the vote. That's what they say. And they say my presence will annoy them and will ruin their cause. Is it not the same cause? Aren't we women too? Aren't I a woman? Indeed, society views us separately, differently, not part of your world. Clearly, this organization holds the same view. I see that you hold the separation higher than the desire to vote, higher than the need to stand tall together as we face down tyranny. No, I will march with the Illinois delegation, and the Southerners be damned if they don't like it. You should know that the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago was formed by Negro women and 2 white women, and the white women were relegated neither to the front nor the back. We marched together, side by side. You all know of my anti-lynching work and of my crusading journalism to expose its horrors, as well as to press for legislation to make lynching a crime anywhere in the United States of America. Yes, the work of gaining the vote is a lever to be used against lynching. People who are free and able to vote can lift the nation beyond what keeps it mired in hatred for its Black citizens. You stood with us as we pushed to abolish slavery so that everyone could be free. And I believe, as I think you do, that a free citizenry that can exercise its power to vote and change things, well, we must all believe that, or else, why are we all here? The Alpha Suffrage Club and the Women's Second World Republican Club are anti-lynching and pro-suffrage organizations. Any white women who see fit to join us do so as equals, not superiors. Susan B. Anthony has tried to convince me that when women get the vote, everything will change. And with Negro and white women working together, I think it might be possible. But if we are to be relegated to the rear anytime someone fears their cause will be lost, I am afraid, Miss Anthony, that I cannot be convinced. No, I will not dress up prejudice and call it politics, nor will I allow anyone else to do so. I will march with the Illinois delegation or not at all. And believe me, I intend to march.
Ida Wells Barnett marched, and she marched with her fellow suffragists in the white Illinois delegation. Alice Paul, the moving force behind the 1913 women's suffrage procession and a towering figure in the fight for the 19th Amendment, had a rival in the movement. The conservative state-by-state strategy that so frustrated Paul on her return from England was spearheaded by Carrie Chapman Catt, Susan B. Anthony's hand-picked successor to run the traditional national suffrage organization. As leaders of the 20th century wave of the movement, Paul and Kat ran two separate parallel campaigns with different focus and different tactics. Paul was militant and aggressive, focused on a high-profile, Washington-targeted strategy for a federal suffragist amendment. She took the fight directly to President Wilson. She and her supporters picketed, served jail time, refused to eat, and endured force feeding. Carrie Chapman Catt skillfully masterminded a less strident but equally determined campaign to gain the vote, one state at a time. A federal amendment requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress to pass the proposed language and then 3/4 of the states to ratify, state legislature by state legislature. Clearly, the power for change rested with the states. Each has 2 senators regardless of its size, and each has an equal voice in ratification regardless of its size. And in the United States in 1920, as still today, there were and remain stark regional differences among the states. Those differences intruded their way directly and painfully into the fight for the vote. The Southern states feared the enfranchisement of African American women, and ratification required the support of at least some of those Southern states. Both Alice Paul and Carrie Catt were challenged to win those Southern legislators to the cause. As Frederick Douglass had calculated that adding women to the 15th Amendment would jeopardize its ratification, now the white suffragists made a similar moral compromise in wooing the racist factions in the South. Let's return to where we started, Nashville, 1920. Catt was there, Paul stayed away, knowing her controversial tactics would make her a lightning rod as the ratification debate in the last state played out. We're about to imagine the thoughts passing through the mind of Carrie Catt, now a global personality and acknowledged titan of suffrage, as she celebrates the outcome of the vote in Tennessee and reflects on what it took to get there.
It came down to this. Tennessee was our last hope. Congress had passed the Woman's Suffrage Amendment, and 35 states had ratified. One more state would take us to the 3/4 required by the Constitution. But 8 states had already defeated the amendment. That left only 5. We had no chance in North Carolina and Florida, and we knew it. In Connecticut and Vermont, the governors refused to call a special legislative session to consider the amendment. That left only Tennessee. Here is what happened. Last Saturday night, August 7th, the great foyer of the Hermitage Hotel here in Nashville was packed with men and women bedecked with roses. The suffragists wore yellow roses and the anti-suffragists red. By tonight, the political fate of the women of the nation rested in the hands of a minority of a single state legislative chamber. The moment was intensely dramatic. Every onlooker knew that the fate of the question might depend upon a single vote. A motion to ratify the amendment was then made, and the vote taken in a tension that was well nigh unbearable. 49 ayes, 47 nays. The House broke into an uproar, and the cheers of triumph that rang through the old legislative chamber were heard far down the street. The Woman's Suffrage Amendment, introduced in Congress in 1878, when I was but 19, will now become the law of the land. So, how did we finally reach this point? How did we get the amendment ratified? My plan, the winning plan, was to organize in the states. And in Tennessee, we surely organized. Listen to how we did it. The women of Tennessee laid aside their political differences and worked together in a manner worthy of imitation by the men of the state. The southern summer heat was merciless, and many legislators lived in remote villages or on farms miles from any town. Yet the women trailed these legislators by train, by motor, by wagon, and on foot, often in great discomfort and frequently at considerable expense to themselves. They went without meals, were drenched in unexpected rains, and met with tire troubles. Yet no woman faltered, and there was not a legislator who had not been visited by his women constituents before the legislature met. Other suffrage leaders had followed other paths. You've heard from one of them, Alice Paul, who organized parades and protests and was even jailed to draw attention to the suffrage cause. My path, as I said, was to organize in the states, but even more, to bring the struggle for suffrage to states where we could win. And in addition, in those states, we needed to choose arguments that could win. So yes, when I campaigned in the South, I did say white supremacy would be strengthened, not weakened, by women's suffrage. And I told them why. Here are the numbers. In the 15 states south of the Mason-Dixon line, the total Negro population is 8,294,274. But the total population of white women is 8,788,901. White women outnumber both Negro males and females by nearly 500,000. If the South really wants white supremacy, it will urge the enfranchisement of women. Yes, I did say those words, and I compiled those statistics for our Southern brethren. But listen to this and hear me now. The South professes to fear the increased Negro vote. The North, the increased foreign vote. The rich, the increased labor vote. The conservative, the increased illiterate vote. Certain elements fear the increased Catholic vote, and still others the increased Jewish vote. Ballot reformers fear the increased corrupt vote, and corruptionists fear the increased reform vote. Ridiculous as this list of objections may appear, each has been supported earnestly by a considerable group, and collectively, they have furnished the basis of opposition to women's suffrage in and out of Congress. But the answer to one is the answer to all. Government by the people is expedient, or it is not. If it is expedient, then obviously all the people must be included. The struggle for women's suffrage is no white woman's struggle, but every woman's struggle. Everybody counts in applying democracy, and there will never be a true democracy until every law-abiding adult in it, without regard to race, sex, color, or creed, has his or her inalienable voice in government.
Carrie Catt took us up to Nashville, August 1920, where the 72-year-long fight for the vote ended with Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment, and she left us with stirring words on the meaning of democracy. But the fight for suffrage didn't end for everyone in 1920. African American women continued to bear the double burden of their Blackness and their womanhood. Jim Crow laws, with their poll taxes, literacy tests, and tolerance of violence and intimidation against African Americans, continued to deprive Black women and Black men of their vote. Fannie Lou Hamer, our next player, knew this intimidation and violence firsthand. She was the youngest of 20 children, born in Mississippi in 1917. She picked cotton and worked as a sharecropper. She lived the outrages of racial violence, including undergoing sterilization during a surgery to remove a uterine tumor. In 1962, outraged by the efforts to deny Blacks the vote, she turned her attention and formidable talents to voter rights. She became a political organizer and a powerful voice in both the civil and voting rights movements. She was arrested for sitting in at a whites-only bus station, and while in jail suffered beatings that left permanent injuries. By 1964, Hamer had a national reputation. She had co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and challenged the pro-segregation Democratic organization. She led her group to the 1964 National Democratic Presidential Convention in Atlantic City and asked to be seated and recognized as official delegates. We're about to hear Hamer's speech to the Credentials Committee at that convention. Television coverage of her appearance was preempted by a press conference called by President Lyndon Johnson to deprive her of a live audience. But Hamer got the last word. Her speech, televised later, was seen by millions and built support for her cause. The 1964 Credentials Committee denied Hamer and her party delegate status. 4 years later, in 1968, Fannie Lou Hamer served as a member of Mississippi's first integrated delegation to a Democratic National Convention. Let's hear Hamer's 1964 speech and the words that laid the foundation for the 1965 Voter Rights Act 1 year later.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Ruleville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis. It was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they allowed only 2 of us to take the literacy test at the time. After we had taken this test and started back to Ruleville, we was held up by the city police and state highway patrolmen and carried back to Indianola, where the bus driver was charged that day with driving a bus the wrong color. After we paid the fine among us, we continued to Ruleville, and Reverend Jeff Sonny carried me 4 miles in the rural area where I had worked as a timekeeper and sharecropper for 18 years. I was met there by my children, who told me the plantation owner was angry because I had gone down to register. After they told me, my husband came and said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and said, "Fannie Lou, do you know? Did Pap tell you what I said?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, I mean that. If you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. Then if you go down and withdraw, you still might have to go, because we're not ready for that in Mississippi." And I addressed him and told him, and I said, "I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself." I had to leave that same night. On the 10th of September, 1962, 16 bullets was fired into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker for me. The same night, 2 girls were shot in Ruleville, Mississippi. Also, Mr. Joe McDonald's house was shot in. On June 9, 1963, I had attended a voter registration workshop. Was returning back home to Mississippi. 10 of us was traveling by the Continental Trailways bus. It was a state highway patrolman and a chief of police ordered us out. I was carried to the county jail and was put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Ivesta Simpson. After I was placed in that cell, I began to hear licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams. And I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigga? Can you say yes, sir?" And they would say other horrible names. She would say, "Yes, I could say yes, sir. So well, say it." She said, "I don't know you well enough." They beat her I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on those people. And it wasn't too long before three white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman, and he asked me where I was from. I told him Ruleville. He said, "We are going to check this." They left my cell, and it wasn't too long before they came back. He said, "You are from Ruleville, all right." And he used a curse word. And he said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead." I was carried out of that cell and into another cell where they had two Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on the bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face, and the first Negro began to beat me. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at the time on my left side because, I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat me until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat me, and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro who had beat me to sit on my feet to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress back down, and he pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this on account we want to register to vote to become first-class citizens. And if the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is not seated, I question America. Is this the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
Our suffragists have spoken. Their stories cast light on a chapter in the history of the fight for the vote that has remained in the shadows. For many of us, the story of suffrage was one of a hard-fought, noble movement that marched slowly but inevitably to victory, of the undaunted women and men who risked ridicule and even harm for the cause. It was this, and it was more. The battle was fierce, and it was also flawed. It still is. It's well over half a century since Fannie Lou Hamer's powerful remarks to the Credentials Committee at the 1964 Democratic Convention. But attempts to suppress the vote haven't stopped. Voter rolls are being purged to disenfranchise targeted groups. States are legislating voter identification requirements that unfairly disadvantage some populations. Districts are closing polling places to create long waits in certain neighborhoods, and more. We need to pay attention. We need to continue the fight. And more than anything, we need to register and vote. Suffragists speak. The fierce and flawed battle for the vote is an original production written and acted by members of the AAUW Northern Monmouth County Branch, the League of Women Voters of Monmouth County, and the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. I'd like to introduce you to the cast. Antonio Johnson as Frederick Douglass of the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. Marion Wattenberger, Susan B. Anthony of the AAUW. Lorraine Stone, Ida Wells Barnett of the AAUW and the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. Connie Goddard as Alice Paul of the AAUW. Ann Torrey Beebe, Carrie Chapman Catt, the League of Women Voters. And Gilda Rogers, Fannie Lou Hamer, AAUW and the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. And I'm Peggy Dellinger, your narrator of the League of Women Voters. Thank you.